There is a moment in autumn when the harvest is over and the world prepares itself for hunger. The trees release their leaves as though surrendering to the inevitable. The animals grow thick-furred and desperate, consuming everything available, storing fat that will keep them alive through months of cold and scarcity. Humans have practiced this rhythm since the beginning of time: prepare or perish, store or starve. It is not complicated. In 1887, in a mountain town called Arrowhead Ridge, Colorado Territory, a young woman named Hattie Ashford was preparing for a winter she knew was coming. A winter she could see in the way the clouds moved across the peaks, in the thickness of the elk herds migrating through the mountain passes, in the instinctive knowledge passed down from her father, who had been a hunter and a tracker, and a man who understood that preparation was the difference between survival and catastrophe. Hattie Ashford was not born to comfort. She was born to a frontier hunter who trusted his daughter with the skills of survival: how to track an animal by the bent grass it left behind, how to read weather in cloud formations, how to preserve meat in the relentless summer heat, how to build a smokehouse that would keep a kill fresh through months of bitter cold. Her father died when she was 17 years old, leaving her his knowledge and his conviction that meat should feed families, not pad the accounts of a greedy merchant. He left her his smokehouse equipment and a single piece of advice that would define her life: if you can solve a problem, you are obligated to solve it. The world will tell you no. Solve it anyway. By the time Hattie was 22 years old, she had put that advice into practice. She had built a smokehouse with her own hands, a structure of wood and stone and clay designed with ventilation shafts and smoke channels that moved heat and smoke evenly across meat racks. She had spent the summer hunting and butchering, teaching herself to process a 700-pound elk into strips thin enough to smoke thoroughly, strategic enough to maximize the yield. She was skilled in a craft that had been practiced for thousands of years, the ancient art of taking what the land offered in abundance and transforming it into survival. In Arrowhead Ridge, a man named Dr. Thaddeus Hartley controlled all the meat. His butchery was the only reliable source of preserved meat for the mining camp and the town alike. He negotiated exclusively with the mining company to supply all provisions. He set the prices. He determined who ate and who went hungry. His profit margins were extraordinary. His power was absolute. And then Hattie Ashford began smoking elk. The town's reaction was swift and scornful. They said she was foolish, a young woman working alone with a pick and a knife, smoking meat in a structure she had built herself. It was the behavior of someone not quite respectable, not quite sane. Reverend Matthias of the Catholic Church said from the pulpit that Hattie was engaging in an unseemly pursuit, that women belonged in domesticity and charity, not in the rough work of animal butchering. The townspeople whispered that she would fail, that her smokehouse would burn or collapse, that the elk would go rotten because she was operating on instinct rather than reason. They called her the meat witch. They said her smokehouse stank of ambition. Dr. Hartley, meanwhile, made his intentions crystal clear. He came to her property in late August when she was in the middle of her work, blood on her apron, smoke rising from her chimney, strips of fresh elk hanging from her racks. He told her bluntly that what she was doing was foolish and economically destructive. He offered to buy her smokehouse equipment at a price that was less than a quarter of its actual value, confident that she would be desperate enough to accept. When she refused, he told her something else. He said that she had no idea how to preserve meat properly, that her methods were amateur, that the elk would spoil and rot, and that she would end up poisoning people. He said that the mining camp depended on proven methods and professional operation. He said that her ego had blinded her to her own incompetence. Hattie looked at him calmly and asked him a simple question. If my methods are so amateur and my meat will spoil so completely, why are you afraid? The question hung between them like smoke, because Dr. Thaddeus Hartley was afraid. He was afraid because 700 pounds of properly smoked elk, meat that could feed families for months, meat that could be sold at prices lower than his, would destroy his monopoly. He was afraid because a young woman with her father's knowledge was a threat to everything he had built. She was afraid because the frontier sometimes listened to people like him and punished people like her, but sometimes it did the opposite. Sometimes it sheltered the prepared and abandoned the arrogant. He left her property without another word. Hattie continued smoking elk. By September, as the hunting season peaked, she had processed and smoked nearly 300 pounds. The quality was immaculate. The smoke flavor was perfect, aromatic, not acrid. The preservation was flawless. She had built a small inventory, and the smell alone was enough to attract attention. Neighbors began to ask if she would sell them some. She did, at prices dramatically lower than Hartley's. By October, as the winter approached and the desperation for preserved food increased, she was processing another 400 pounds. She purchased it from Samuel Wickham, an old frontiersman in his 70s who hunted the mountain passes and had known her father for decades. He supported her work publicly, which made him an enemy of Hartley's, but he did not care. He was near the end of his life and had no patience for merchants who profited from scarcity. As Hattie worked through October and into November, the scale of her achievement became apparent. 700 pounds of elk, smoked and cured to perfection, stored in her smokehouse. The quality was superior to Hartley's products. The price was half what Hartley charged. The impact was devastating to his business. His contracts with the mining camp suddenly came into question. The company was paying double the price for no superior quality. Someone could provide the same meat, better, actually, for half the cost. Dr. Hartley went to the town council and made accusations. He claimed that Hattie was operating without sanitary permits, that her methods were unproven, that she posed a public health risk. He suggested that the council should shut down her operation, or, at minimum, require her to comply with the same regulations he followed, regulations that would cost her hundreds of dollars in modifications and inspections. It was a deliberate attempt to price her out of her own business. But something changed in the town. Father Matthias, the priest who had initially condemned her work, came to her property and witnessed her operation firsthand. He saw the careful sanitation, the precise smoking temperature, the meticulous storage. He saw a young woman working with the skill of someone who had been trained by a master. He saw a woman who was solving a problem that wealthy merchants profited from, feeding poor families affordably. And he decided to act. Father Matthias stood in his church and told his congregation that Hattie Ashford was engaged in holy work. He said that she was feeding the hungry, which was explicitly a Christian obligation. He said that monopoly was a sin against community. He said that the pursuit of truth in craft and honesty in commerce were virtues, and that Hattie embodied both. The momentum shifted. The council, which had been ready to shut her down, suddenly had political pressure in the opposite direction. When Hartley pushed for regulations, the council instead offered her a provisional permit pending inspection. An independent inspector came to her smokehouse, examined her process, tasted her product, and declared it superior to the competitors. There would be no shutdown. Instead, there would be regulation, fair regulation, applied equally to all meat processors, which meant that Hartley, who had been operating for years without proper sanitary conditions, would now be required to upgrade his facilities or face fines. He was furious. His rage became visible to everyone. His voice grew louder, his movements more aggressive, his words more vicious. He stopped hiding his contempt for Hattie. He began spreading rumors that she was immoral, that her father had abandoned her, that she had learned her craft from men rather than family. He was losing, and he was showing it. By December, as the winter deepened, the mining camp faced a crisis. A late October avalanche had buried supplies en route from the southern settlements. The company had to request emergency provisions from the local suppliers. Hartley's inventory was lower than usual because the mining camp had begun to shift some of their contracts to Hattie, whose meat was cheaper and superior. He did not have enough to supply the camp for the entire winter. He would have had to raise prices or disappoint the company. Either way, his monopoly would be broken. Instead, in mid-December, a terrible storm hit the mountain passes. Snow fell for 3 days without stopping. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero. The wind made travel impossible. The mining camp, which was designed for temporary seasonal workers, was not prepared for a prolonged crisis. The barracks were drafty. The food was running short. Hartley, who had contracted to supply them through March, suddenly found himself unable to meet the obligation. His supply was insufficient. His prices were too high. His methods were suddenly exposed as inadequate. And Hattie Ashford had 700 pounds of smoked elk, perfectly preserved, ready to distribute. The mining company came to her first, not to Hartley. They sent a representative who offered to purchase every piece of meat she had at her quoted price. She said yes. She began distribution in mid-December and continued through March. Her smokehouse became, for those 3 months, the lifeline between 50 miners and starvation. Some of them were sick with mine lung and weak from physical labor. Some were immigrants who had never known a winter this harsh. Some were fathers sending portions of their ration back to families in town, choosing to go hungry so their children could eat. Hattie distributed meat in exactly the quantity that each family needed. No haggling, no profiteering, no advantage taken. She simply provided, day after day, week after week. Through the worst of the winter, when the temperature never rose above zero and the world felt like it was freezing solid, she distributed her elk. By February, her stock was visibly depleting. She had planned for a winter ending in early April, but the cold had extended through February and into March. The supply that should have lasted until April was beginning to run short. The mining company, desperate, asked her what they would do if she ran out before March ended. Hattie simply said she would not run out. She would adjust the portions if necessary. She would source more game if she could, but the families would not starve. She had built this smokehouse and smoked this elk specifically to prevent starvation. That was the purpose. That was the only purpose. Dr. Thaddeus Hartley, meanwhile, was collapsing. His contracts had evaporated. The mining company, having discovered that Hattie could supply meat at half his price and superior quality, had no reason to return to him. The townspeople, many of whom had family members in the mining camp, had witnessed Hattie's character firsthand. They had seen her distribute meat during the worst crisis the region had faced in a decade. They had seen Hartley disappear entirely, leaving the crisis to someone else to solve. By March, when the winter finally began to break and the temperature slowly climbed back toward freezing, the business landscape of Arrowhead Ridge had transformed. Hattie Ashford, the young woman everyone had dismissed and condemned, had become the person the community depended on. She had built something valuable. She had anticipated a crisis. She had solved it, and she had done it with integrity and fairness that made everyone else look small. In late March, the town council held a formal meeting to discuss the winter's events and what they meant for the future food supply. They voted unanimously to grant Hattie a permanent operating license. They proposed creating a formal contract where she would supply preserved meats to the mining camp on a rotating annual basis. They suggested that the example of her operation should inspire others to develop complementary food preservation businesses: dried vegetables, grain storage, fruit preservation, to ensure that the region would never again depend on a single merchant's whims for survival. And they formally apologized for the initial skepticism they had shown. Reverend Matthias asked her to speak to the church about her methods, so that other young women who might have gifts in preservation and butchering would not be discouraged by society's judgment. Father Matthias, who had initially condemned her work from the pulpit, was now defending it. Dr. Thaddeus Hartley sat in that meeting with his hands shaking. He said nothing. His empire, built on monopoly and scarcity, had been destroyed by one young woman and a smokehouse full of properly preserved elk. He had tried to intimidate her, to accuse her, to price her out of existence, and she had simply continued her work. She had smoked her 700 pounds of elk. She had fed 50 families through the winter. She had proved him wrong in the most public way possible. By the time spring arrived and the passes opened and new suppliers could begin the seasonal routes, Hattie Ashford had become a legend in Arrowhead Ridge. The young woman everyone had called the Meat Witch had become the woman who saved the mining camp. The frontier never forgave the arrogant, but it sheltered the prepared, and sometimes the person everyone dismissed is the only one with the courage to solve what others say is impossible. Subscribe to Winter Whispers for more stories of frontier wisdom and quiet survival.